is I'm going to kind of race through the PowerPoint to a degree because I did conflate it for today. Trauma-informed care is typically an hour, a full day, but I wanted to still keep enough in that I set the tone for the second half of this presentation. So the first part is really just a primer on what trauma is, what it does to the body and brain. Not because this is a science class, but because if we have a basic understanding of that, then the second half about what works and what helps and what heals and what we can avoid doing to further traumatize makes more sense. If I'm going too fast or if you need to flag me down, please let me see your hand. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to see people's faces, but I don't know how else to get that to happen. So we'll just go forward. So, I've done outpatient therapy with elderly folks, and like all of us, I've had lots of elderly folks in my life. I will say this, that I often have said, I think in residential places for elderly folks, there should always be one person slated with the task of going around and writing down the stories, interviewing elderly folks and kind of making a little booklet for them, but for their families, but also because of the wisdom and the knowledge that's packed in there. And I think as a society generally don't do the greatest job of honoring what elderly folks have. And by the time some of you work with them, perhaps your focus needs to be on the problems that they're having, which of course is true. And yet, buried deep inside sometimes is all this stuff they have to offer. And, trauma-informed care can kind of gently coach that out sometimes because of the need of the way it creates a safe atmosphere. So let's just go on with this. Basically, trauma is either a single event or multiple events or a set of circumstances, like, for instance, severe poverty or severe loneliness, chronic loneliness, that is experienced by the individual as physically and emotionally harmful, and that it also has long-lasting adverse effects, usually in all the areas that are listed there. The truth is, if you live long enough on this earth, you're going to have some trauma. Another truth is that what's traumatic for you might not be traumatic for another person. And yet there are some things that if it happened to anybody, it would be traumatic. So, for instance, if a bomb went off beside your building right there, everybody would be traumatized to a degree, but it still doesn't dictate how long the effects of the trauma will last, and how many parts of that person's lives will be affected. And there are certain things that mitigate the effects of trauma and certain things that do the reverse, which is make somebody much more susceptible. And so one thing I want to, just kind of go over here is part of my screen? Okay, let me try to, bear with me. I don't know. I'm going to do this because so the first part of what I'm showing, the cumulative life traumas, with elderly folks, it's the statistical likelihood of someone who's elderly, 70s, 80s, 90s, having been traumatized goes up, of course, just by virtue of the fact that they've lived so long. And there's some of the cumulative life traumas, maybe abuse from their childhood. The idea that trauma somehow just fades away with time has been proven to be false. It's in the body. It's in our cells, so to speak. It's certainly in our minds. If anybody's if you want, I think it's the Bible of trauma and trauma-informed care. It's Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and he names it that because trauma does stay in our bodies. So even if we're not consciously aware or can't even remember everything, what trauma does to the body stays in there unless there has been some healing. So some of your elderly folks might have a real cluster of these things. They might have had abusive relationships, either in their family of origin or in their marriages or partnerships, or perhaps with members of their family. And by then, of course, multiple deaths of loved ones, even though that's a natural part of life. Of course, some people have an inordinate amount of that having happened, and it kind of builds on these other things. And then the oncome of disease and disability that might happen, and often does, of course, with elderly folks. And then just your basic life traumas, like that many people have: wars, disasters, chronic poverty. We know now, we've actually known it for some time, but it's more in the everyday lexicon. We understand that chronic poverty traumatizes people because of the level of chronic stress. And so, and then some other things like, oppression and racism, and some people just have a life filled with adversity. So those accumulate, if you will. One of those things might not create a traumatized person, but certainly the more we add to them. And then the second half of this slide, elderly folks now are facing, the multiple losses of friends and family, loss of mobility, perhaps some of their faculties, their dignity, their memory, abuse and neglect. I realize I'm preaching to the choir with these things, but I'm listing them because I want you to keep in mind this idea of a kindling effect of trauma. That, when you make a campfire, you keep adding these little sticks, and one little stick doesn't create the fire, but you get enough sticks and it'll catch, So this idea that people can go through their lives, decades, seemingly doing fine, and maybe there's just a piece of kindling that lands. It could be the loss of their best friend, or the loss of their mobility or independence, and then now there's somebody who's really manifesting symptoms of trauma where before they did not. And then, add that to the fact that the manifestation of trauma includes some mental health situations, diagnoses even, and it might be difficult to tease that out from dementia or just general effects of aging. So it's not always possible to know the things that people have been through. Trauma-informed care, as we'll mention a little bit later, really asks us to assume that everybody that you work with, assume in advance that every elderly person you work with has been traumatized. And then once you know their story and gain their trust and you get a sense, you might recognize that they're not, a victim of trauma, or a survivor of trauma. But that keeps us from doing and saying things perhaps that would add fuel to that fire, to add stress. I mean, it's stressful alone. Sometimes the last piece of kindling is somebody being, placed in a care home, even if it's necessary for their health and safety. That's such a final thing, and there's so much loss and discomfort and unfamiliarity, and for lots of people. And maybe I'll just ask right now, without even looking at what we have coming next, what have you noticed in some of the elderly folks you work with that you kind of can say, yeah, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. This set them into a bad place. You can see how stressed they are, how maybe they've gone into a deep depression, etc. Who has an example of that? Just to flesh out, a real life example from some of you that do the hands-on work. You have an example of someone you've worked with that you got the idea that it's like enough's enough. It's just too much. They need some extra tender loving care because of what they've been through. Nobody. Okay. Myself in my personal life and my professional life, lots of examples of people, even an elderly person who's brought into their family's home, which might seem like an ideal situation, but circumstances require them to give up quite a bit of how they live their daily life. They don't have their own space. Maybe they don't have much privacy, and it can send people, it's just the straw or the piece of kindling that really kind of, does them in. And so just keeping that in mind, that maybe from the outside, it looks like, oh, this is a good thing for them, or, what's the problem? They're safe, they have their medication, they have people around them. But without asking questions, without listening, we don't necessarily know how that is for someone. And by the way, if you do, obviously, if you have a question or want to even challenge what I'm offering or just have an example, which would really be nice to flesh this out for everybody, just raise your hand or unmute yourself and interrupt me, because I can't really tell if you're all right. This is one of the most important slides, and honestly, if you only took one slide away with you, it would be this. And these two terms are going to come up again. And this is science-based. The two most important predictors of whether somebody develops PTSD or even just the severity of trauma's effects are secure attachment and self-compassion. And this comes from the decades of trauma research that's been happening. We have more and more. There's just more out there now that we've learned from. And so the good news is that when a traumatic thing or series of events happens, if the person has attachments to loving, empathic, safe people, and or if they have a sense of self-compassion, that they honor themselves, they do self-care, they reach out for help, and obviously both of those are even better, the effects of traumatic events are significantly not eliminated, but brought to a place where it's more manageable and healing is more likely sooner. Those two things are also the predictor of whether somebody heals from trauma. So we're going to hear these two terms again: secure attachment and self-compassion. And so I'd like you to start thinking about, in your work with elderly people, how do you set that up? How do you individually provide it? How do you teach or model self-compassion? How do you connect elderly folks with resources that help with these things? Secure attachment is, includes if somebody's chronically lonely, you don't have secure attachments. So that alone is a real service, getting folks connected on a regular basis with benevolent others, of course. So you'll see these terms again, for sure. Much of this information, the effects of severe stress and or trauma, come from something called the ACEs study. I took out those slides just because of time, but basically in the 1990s, something called the ACEs study was done. I recommend you look it up, ACE study. And what we found was, lo and behold, many of us know this instinctively, perhaps from your own life, that chronic stress and trauma leads to just about every kind of physical disease, as well as social problems, mental health problems. So here's just some of them: depression, suicide, heart disease, cancer, lung disease, immune system disorders. That's a big one. Things like fibromyalgia and, lupus and similar immune system disorders. We know now that for many people, that's caused by the immune system being pummeled by the way the brain is reset during trauma. And I'll get to that. Obesity, because people look to substances, sometimes food, to quell the really bad physical feelings they have from stress and trauma. Of course, drug and alcohol use, abuse, and addiction. We know now in the drug and alcohol field that I think the estimate tends to be about 90% of people who get addicted have been severely traumatized in their life. And I like that stat because it helps us move away from a moralistic, judgmental treatment model about addiction. Those things have no place in treatment of drug and alcohol, but it has historically. It's the idea that human beings reach for things that make us feel better. You and I do that probably on a daily basis, even if it's your morning coffee, so to speak. But it nudges people into using substances. And even elderly folks who've never had difficulty with substance abuse might turn to their overuse medications because it's the one thing that kind of quells their anxiety or their sadness or numbs them out from all the loss and things like that. And so, that is an increased risk there. So there's a lot more. So in short, severe stress and trauma has a strong graded relationship to all these kinds of health, social, and behavioral problems. Oh, I'm sorry. Throughout the entire lifespan. So in a nutshell, if one of your elderly folks was severely traumatized as a child, never got treatment, never had secure attachments, never healed through excellent relationships, loving relationships, exercise, nature, all the things that we'll talk about later that heal, it didn't go away just because they're 80. The old adage of time heals, that's only up to a point and only really with certain things because of the nature of the way trauma changes our brain and our autonomic nervous system. There's a reset that's done, and unless there's a concerted effort at healing and treating somebody with trauma, it stays that way, basically. And so, maybe they aren't currently under tremendous stress, but their old traumas and stressors still live in that body. And it's important to remember that. So basically, what trauma does is, it sets up an alarm system in our body. Our autonomic nervous system starts shooting out lots of cortisol and adrenaline and some other neurochemicals to get us ready for what's down here on the right. I got to fight this, I got to flee it, I got to freeze. And that keeps us alive as a species. But when it's chronic, when it's unabated, when it's too big, the neural system actually gets altered, reset. So much so that there can actually be epigenetic change, which is severe trauma can actually change the way our DNA is manifested in our bodies. And I think that's fascinating. That's how severe it can be in its effects. And that to the left, that parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest. And that's not tapped into very much by the traumatized brain and body. And all of this happens on a continuum. Some people are up at the high end and you can almost visibly see the effects of their trauma. So, we'll talk about what that looks like in behaviors and symptoms and things. Usually I spend a lot of time on the brain. I just want to mention a few things. I wish I had my annotation here. Yeah, do it. If you look at what's called the instinctive brain, or we call it the reptilian brain, it's like a little moniker we give it. And the reason it's called that is because that's the first part of the brain that evolved, and reptiles even have that. And that's the one that's nervous. It's survival, basic human needs. It's, am I in danger? Am I going to be able to live? Is this going to kill me? Is that going to hurt me? If we didn't have that, all of us would put our hands on hot things and we'd walk out into traffic, and, we need that part of our brain a lot. And what happens when there's a real stressor or chronic stress, our brains revert to just around that area. We're just doing that. And that's good, except when it doesn't stop. When the trauma has been too big or the stressors have been too many, we stay stuck in that reptilian brain, and this is why we see certain behaviors and symptoms. And what also the emotional brain, that kind of middle area, the limbic system, that's where emotions and memories and attachments to other people, that is stimulated as well when there's danger, when there's trauma. And so people are, wildly emotional or numbed out there, and there's not a whole lot of space for them to go up forward into that thinking brain. The reasoning and logic and motor commands and language. In fact, if you've ever witnessed somebody who's just been through a trauma, you'll notice that they have trouble often putting things into words, really kind of recognizing where they are and what's going on around them. It's difficult. They feel overwhelmed with verbal and visual cues, because that thinking brain is kind of offline. That's something to remember, that the traumatized brain has the thinking brain offline, and basically people are stuck in the emotional brain, and particularly in that instinctive brain. It's kind of walking around the world just hyper vigilant about what shoe's going to drop next. There are people who've lived their whole lives like that. Thankfully, we know so much more now that there's more and more widely available treatments, and you don't have to go into a facility to get treated for trauma. We know lots and lots of things. Some of them are ancient, that help get that brain back online, help soothe this reptilian brain. So that's some good news. On the front end of this presentation, we're talking about the bad stuff that happens, the tough stuff, but we'll get to the other. But I like laying this foundation because then it makes sense when we talk about what works, hopefully. So there's three ways, essential ways, that the traumatized brain is different than a normal brain. First of all, the threat perception is enhanced. A traumatized brain is a fear-based brain. Many of us know somebody who's a contemporary that kind of walks around the earth nervous, fearful, hypervigilant, super sensitive, startle responses through the roof, all that kind of stuff. Their brain is kind of stuck in that reptilian brain. It's a very uncomfortable way to live, as you can imagine. And then another way that it's different is that filtering system of the higher brain, the logic and reasoning, gets disturbed. It's really difficult for people to stay up there in that frontal lobe and, look around and say, well, that looks safe, and that, okay, maybe this person can help. It's not that accessible because they're mostly spending time in that reptilian and emotional brain. And a third way, a major way that research has told us the traumatized brain is different, is the self-sensing system gets blunted. People look for ways to dampen the physical discomfort of fear and anxiety. So whether that's substances or dissociating, numbing out, just to stop all those sensory sensations. People consciously and unconsciously look for ways to get a break from that hypervigilance, that hypersensitivity to everything. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Too much? Okay. All right. Basically, and this is for children, but really this applies to any age. So when you think of folks that you're working with, if they feel safe and loved, it frees up their brain to cooperate, to play games, to want to learn and try new things, to explore the world around them, etc. If you stay stuck in that reptilian brain, you don't have healing relationships, you don't have good attachments, you're not doing self-care, self-compassion, you're frightened and hurt and threatened and maybe feel unwanted, the brain just keeps specializing in managing all those feelings of fear and abandonment. And it's sort of the order of the day after day. It's not a mood. It is a state of being, if you will. And maybe from the outside, it looks like the person has what they need to survive. But if they're living in that fear-based brain and they have these other things, that they're concerned. What's going to happen to me? Who's going to take care of me? Where's my stuff? I don't have kind people helping me. I feel unwanted. I feel that nobody cares about me. It kind of encourages that brain to stay in that reptilian fear-based state. So, and you can bring people away from that, but it certainly isn't instantaneous. It takes time and concerted effort to, if you will, coax people into that frontal lobe again, into being open, taking risks, having some trust. Otherwise, that's the default mode of a traumatized brain, a fear-based, threatened kind of brain. So some of your folks, your elderly folks, have lived that way, much or all of their lives if they were traumatized early. And, the truth is we really didn't know much scientifically about what trauma does to the brain and body many years ago. Although instinctively, I think we've known that art and nature and exercise and great relationships are healing. There really wasn't a lot of concerted effort at treating trauma. Medications came along, but medications don't treat the trauma. They only treat the physical discomfort of trauma. They don't get rid of the trauma that's inside the body and brain. So I like this quote: memory's not only the domain of the mind, our bodies literally remember traumatizing events in their own kind of way, and so they respond down to the cellular level, and this has been proven, and all of our organs. And so it's not just the brain, it's really the entire body. All the major organs are affected by that autonomic nervous system, and that's why it leads, unchecked trauma and stress leads to all these diseases, because there's no healing that's done. All the organs are involved and connected to the autonomic nervous system, and over time they get worn out. They get very susceptible to infections, to cancer cells, to, immune system problems, the things that we mentioned before. In the body, so we talked about the brain, and of course the brain is part of the body, so it's not that it's separate, but the rest of the body, implicit memory is laid down in there, which is one reason why people can react to something that happens and a person with them is trying to connect the dots and they can't really understand what the big deal is, because the person who's upset isn't able or willing to verbalize what the memory is or what their fear is, but their body is reacting because it's been reacting for years and years to, the fears that they have. The biochemistry of the neuroendocrine system is altered after a lot of years of just, shooting out those stress hormones. Things change there, and sensations and emotions feel like they're never going to end. That's why suicidality goes up in population, the traumatized population, if you will, because it's incredibly uncomfortable. I mentioned Bessel van der Kolk. He's the guru to me of trauma. If you look him up, I think I have him listed on a resource page at the end. You'll get a gazillion Google hits, but he talks about how the body just feels bad so much of the time, and sometimes so bad that people just want a way out. They don't necessarily want to die, but they want those bad feelings to stop, and they can't on their own, get it to stop. It speeds the process of disease and aging, even in young people. We already talked about the immune system, and stress hormones spike much more quickly, disproportionate to stimuli. That maybe they're startled so easily and they freak out at things that are just little things to you or I, but they're baseline is very, very low now as to what can sort of set them off because of chronic stress or trauma. So those constantly elevated hormones lead to long-term health issues. They can't, it can't not, because it's not how our body was designed to be. In other words, the old, go back many thousands of years, it was really good if a tiger was near your cave to go back into that reptilian brain and get your body ready to fight or flee or whatever. That's good. But thankfully, the tiger didn't come around every day. Or now you're a traumatized person and you can't really operate in the day-to-day realm in any kind of calm or centered way. And modern life exacerbates the constantly elevated stress hormones. I think probably everybody on this call here can relate to that. We have way too much stuff talking at us, beeping at us, calling for our attention. Our brains are not designed to handle that. And, that speaks to our own need to limit and put boundaries up about what we let in on any given, because it's all too much, so to speak. And it's definitely that way for traumatized folks. Questions or examples needed for anybody? I'm just going to check in every so often. At the end, I'll just ask you the one thing that you thought was most useful. What we're going to, just 225, okay. So this is what Bessel van der Kolk said. What makes life unbearable for traumatized people isn't the emotions they feel necessarily, it's the physical sensations. And that shows up in the chest, in the muscles tensing, the gastro system is a big one, headaches, and then the diseases we talk about. The emotions themselves are difficult, but the physical sensations of a traumatized brain and body is really what ends up putting people in a bad place. It changes people's ability to have relationships and even their personality. It's hard for people. If your brain is busy dealing with fear all the time, it's kind of difficult to relate and trust people. And if you're stuck in survival mode in that reptilian brain, it takes your energy. You don't really have a whole lot for nurturing and fun and caring and loving. You might have some, but you're so busy being in survival mode. Many of us know stories, or we've read books about or seen movies about people coming back from war, because for a long time that's where everybody could relate. Oh yeah, that's traumatizing. Of course, we know there's many more things that traumatize. And the person, a soldier comes back and they lots of divorce, lots of breakups, family breakups, because they're not able to be present very much. They're preoccupied with staying safe and how bad they feel, and it's really sad. It's a tragedy. We're getting better. We're getting better at treating that. But if it's untreated, if there isn't anything done through a whole variety of things, then that's where the person kind of stays stuck. And all these other things show up: frustration, irritation, difficulty communicating. And so people with trauma, no matter what age, struggle on a regular basis with trying to have decent, open, relaxed relationships, and sometimes it's near impossible, depending on how much they've been affected. Here are some of the symptoms and behaviors that you might see. So this hypersensitivity, a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Believe it or not, traumatized people, it's typical for them to have shame and sometimes even guilt, as in, how did I let this happen to me? What's wrong with me? Why am I so weak? How come other people seem to be doing okay? That's common, and it's unnecessary, from the outside, but that's a very common thing. Of course, extreme anxiety, we all know about flashbacks. You can't stop those from coming unless you get your body and brain healed, from this. Dissociation, just trying to kind of block out what's going on. A sense of lack of purpose. If we make it to the end of this, as Viktor Frankl said, if you can find a sense of purpose in your life, life will be worth living. Traumatized people often just feel like damaged goods and life is terrible, and they just don't really see the point in a lot of the stuff other people are up to. And then some behaviors on the right. And this, how many of you are involved in direct care in facilities with elderly folks? Could you let me know? I'm just trying to get a feel for the different. If we have more time, I could go around and find out what everybody does. But is anybody involved in direct care in facilities, or is it all out in the community? Okay. So some behaviors are extreme reactions to even small stimuli. Rule defiance. This is important because, look, if you have an elderly person in a facility or at a, you know, um, just a place in the community that offers, you know, activities and things, you might see rule defiance as just a bad personality trait. But a lot of times, if somebody is untrusting of what's around them and they are just worried about who's going to get me, what's going to happen, they feel uncomfortable, some of the things we ask them to do might feel unsafe. So even things like go over, you know, let's come over here and stand in line, or, you know, asking them to play games where they have to cover their eyes, or just all kinds of things. And people say, I'm not doing that. I mean, it might be a personality thing, but it might be because they are feeling very vulnerable and scared. And certain things we ask them to do, like go, okay, line up, you know, down the hall is the bathroom, and the hall is dark and they can't find it. And, you know, they have an accident because they just didn't listen to what, and there's so many ways that these behaviors show up, and it looks like it's just bothersome behavior. Trouble problem solving and reasoning, of course, mistrust. They might be volatile and defensive. Those aren't the only reasons that elderly person get aggressive, but trauma will help that happen as well. They might be over compliant in the sense of they've just said, look, I'll just go along to get along. That's very common with people who've been chronically sexually or physically abused as children. Their boundaries have been smashed, and they learned that the only way to sort of survive, literally sometimes, was to just do as they were told, no matter what. And they don't have self-compassion, and they don't have boundaries, and they have allowed that has made them vulnerable, you know, perhaps all of their lives. It's difficult to be playful and curious when you're in that fear-based brain. And it's difficult to self-regulate and become calm after getting upset. There might be high-risk behavior. They might avoid people or things that remind them of negative experiences, you know, and difficulty paying attention. Feel the fear of change. You know, some of your elderly population have to go through lots of change. They lose their independent living situation. They lose their driver's license. They have to be or live somewhere else. They're around new people. Lots of changes, often in a cluster. And this is terrifying to some people, because one of the things that people want to feel, if you're scared, is safety. And when there's too much change, it doesn't feel very safe. Anybody want to share any of the time that you've seen some of these behaviors or symptoms in an elderly person with whom you work?
Barbara, I'd like to make a comment, I guess, and have you comment too, because what
Yeah.
I constantly think about is the social dimensions. And, you know, we had a nasty, and I worked in a retirement community and nursing center, so we had a nasty uptick in this year in just really ugly behavior, ugly anger
Yeah.
mainly coming out of family members. And it sort of supported my adage that people who are ugly, angry, and mean and difficult often are in pain, usually are in pain.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is where my head goes. And so
Yep.
you're connecting a lot of dots.
Sure.
And I think then this then leads to the discussion about abuse and how therefore there is the potential for unhinged kind of behavior and relational
Yes.
stuff that attacks
Even
elderly.
from family members, not necessarily from the
Indeed.
elderly themselves, but from family members. Is that what you're saying, Stephen? That a lot of it, yeah. And was a lot of that, do you believe, COVID related? That because of they couldn't see their, for a lot of changes there.
Yeah, absolutely. And of
Yeah.
course, there was separation anxiety and
Yes.
just angry. They were angry at me, and it wasn't my fault, but
No, but you're,
I was in
you're
the crossfire.
that's right. They're killing the messenger, right? So if you think, Stephen, even just on a global, this pandemic, of course, I'm not telling you something you don't know. There is a global anxiety. And so when we go back to that kindling effect I talked about, for many people, this pandemic, the fear and also the losses that come along with that. So loss of livelihood, loss of money, loss of comfort and safety, those are big fat pieces of kindling. So for somebody who maybe was going along in life doing okay, this pandemic we know in this country alone that the increase in mental health crises calls, for instance, has gone up. I think something like 75%. This overlay, if you will, this pandemic on both the elderly themselves, because think about it, many of them are extra lonely, they can't see their loved ones, and then on family members who can't check in and can't, have the comforts of being able to visit and bring things and all that. Absolutely. So backing up to some of the and it's not an excuse as much as a way to understand that this defensiveness and aggressiveness that is part of traumatized people's repertoire, maybe more often than average, increases because the pandemic is a chronic stress for virtually everybody, and for some, it's a super stressor. So it makes sense. I'm sure by now, Stephen, you have thick skin, but it's not pleasant to work when you're kind of the butt of all that. But if we kind of put it in its place as we understand where it comes from, and obviously we know not to take it personally, it makes it a little easier to navigate those waters. But yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you for reminding all of us that, the pandemic itself is exacerbating any of these behaviors for people who are already under a lot of stress. Thank you. So here are two other words that I hope you remember, and that is that the two main concerns that a traumatized person has are in the categories of safety and control. And what I'd like to do at this point is ask some folks, in the services that you provide to elderly people, um, what are things that help provide a sense of safety and a sense of control to the folks that you serve?
I would say staying in a familiar environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that certainly provides safety, and the control part also is, if they're familiar, then they have their things set up like they like them, and probably routines that they have some say in. Yeah, absolutely. That's not always possible, but to whatever degree we can keep folks in a familiar environment, or at least surrounded by lots of familiar things, and allow them choice, that control piece, we can go a long way to providing that with brainstorming all the ways we can give elderly people choice because they've lost a lot of control. They can't get themselves from point A to point B. They've lost access to vehicles. They, have been put somewhere that they aren't familiar with. They're not able to cook for themselves anymore. Whatever stuff has been taken adds to a sense of lack of control. And so you might think about it as then substituting some new ways that they can gain some sense of control. It can be as simple as, how do you want your room set up? What do you want to eat? What clothes do you like to? I mean, everything we can think of to provide feasible choices to folks goes a long way to providing control. And if there's more control felt, then they feel a little safer by default. But this is factors matter the most to traumatized people. And without those, they just remain in that fear-based brain, and they're just trying to, survive. So in a nutshell, if somebody has a compassionate, safe, predictable atmosphere and cognitive opportunities and empathy, then they can kind of operate, as a self-regulating, thoughtful person. If they're if it's a frightening atmosphere, a hurtful atmosphere, there's a lack of empathy, a lack of supportive, benevolent relationships and safety and nurturing, then we're going to find more impulsiveness and aggressiveness and inattentive behavior and lots of relational difficulties. I mean, it almost can't be different because of what we learned about the brain and the body. So I'm going to move a little quicker because I do want to. So now we're in trauma-informed care. It's a collaborative healing environment. Collaborative as in we ask the person regularly and consistently how we're doing. What do they need? How can we provide safety? How can we provide choice? How can we help you build some coping skills? And it begins at first contact. Trauma-informed care, as we just went over, recognizes the two main concerns of safety and control. And we integrate knowledge about trauma into how we set up programs and residences, procedures, practices. If we know, for instance, that a traumatized person has a real sensitive startle, system going on, we don't want to walk up behind people and shout at them or touch them from behind or big loud noises, or we want to reduce that stuff as much as we can on any given day. We want to offer, of course, a warm, supportive environment. We want to empower people instead of treating them like, well, you've lost all that. Now we're in charge and you've lost your facilities. Find every way. Help them find their strengths, their abilities, no matter what it might be. Maybe it's that they write, that they publish a newsletter. Maybe it's that they're in charge of the bingo game. Maybe it's they get to help come up with the menus. I mean, all these sometimes small but cumulative ways we can empower elderly people in general, but certainly for those who feel scared quite a bit. Otherwise, we can look to them to be not very engaged with programming that we have. So some things, the first thing we want to do is prevent re-traumatization. We can't always know, of course, if someone's been traumatized, but that's why you sort of assume everybody is and then work backward from there. But some things that prevent it are a lot of no's. Do we have a lot of signs up that say, no doing this? Or can we turn that around into just instructive things, more positively stated? Instead of, no food in your room, we could say food needs to stay in the dining room. There's just a psychological stressor of seeing and hearing no all the time. Because that really, interferes with a person's sense of safety and control. So, and then, procedures and paperwork, do we just, is it just too much? Do we have things too complicated or too much at a time where somebody's brain is already struggling to stay in this frontal lobe? Invading people's personal space is a biggie. I think it's not uncommon for people to treat the elderly as little children again, whereby we can just rush in and touch them and maneuver them whenever we want to. So things like asking permission, letting them know what you're going to be doing next if you're coming closer, to just avoid abrupt or unwelcome touch, that we respect that need they have for safety and ask permission and set up that kind of respect and that sort of, and they can be a little bit calmer about all the people that are around them, for instance. Unnecessary stimuli is a big one. Is there too much noise? Are there too many people around? In certain instances, is it loud and crazy with chairs and tape? Is there too much clutter? Is there too much physical clutter that keeps people sort of hyper vigilant? All that kind of stuff. And really, to change the question, the kind of questioning from, what's wrong with you to what happened to you? What's happened to you in your life? What has happened that has you feeling afraid? What has happened to you that you find it difficult to trust others? What's happened that has made this change feel so big and overwhelming to you? Instead of questions that have them feeling like something's wrong with them or something's bad. So all of that is involved in trauma-informed care. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, SAMHSA, is a great clearinghouse for all kinds of mental health and drug and alcohol information. It's terrific. And they have these 4 principles of trauma-informed care. Providing safety, we've already said. Being trustworthy. Because somebody's elderly and has a bad memory or doesn't seem to be sort of absorbing, doesn't give us license to try to fool them or tell them untruths because you think, well, they'll never figure it out, that, they won't find out. To really be respectful enough that we need to be transparent and tell them the truth, the things that they need, that they deserve to know. And if we say we're going to do something, we follow through as best we can and things like that. Peer support is a principle. Connecting them with peers, not just now and then, but on some kind of a regular basis. Make it a collaborative experience. It's not just us telling them what we're going to do for them and they should just listen to everything we say, but a case plan or the plan for moving or the plan for getting services is we ask and include their preferences, their ideas, their perspectives, not just tolerate it, but invite it, because then now they feel they have some control and they're much more likely to be cooperative and follow through. And we already talked about how can we empower people and give them a voice, till the day they die, that they have a voice in how their life is going, if it's feasible and if it's safe. And then trying to take into consideration what they've been through, culturally, historically. Those are the 6 pillars or principles of trauma-informed care. And we won't go into them further there, but obviously knowing our community resources, what's out there, and I'm guessing that most of or all of you are pretty up to date on services out there in the community for elderly, and if you're not, to make sure that somebody in your agency is a clearinghouse of that information. Agencies change, programs change, groups pop up and then go away. To have somebody, it's a good idea to have somebody on your staff who, as part of their value-added position, keeps kind of a running tab on all the things out there, not just for elderly either, but also cultural experiences and parks and theater and music and, as well as services directly related to elderly people. Because those plugins provide what we've already talked to, that's crucial, which are a sense of empowerment, engaging that frontal lobe, brain lobe, stimulating them with positive things, giving them choice, that kind of thing. And so some of the components of trauma-informed care include crisis plans. Self-care plans are fantastic. because that's that self-compassion, to really talk with them individually about, all right, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and every once in a while, let's make 3 lists of things that you're going to do to provide self-care, and then not dictate the list, collaborate, brainstorm a list and add to the list, and give them a sense of empowerment of, here's what feels good to me, here's what I like, how I like things to be. And, some of these other things, sometimes social skills, leisure development. Some of our elderly folks, because they lived in a time when leisure and wasn't looked upon as a necessity like it is today, that maybe they grew up in the Depression or thereafter. Lots of folks from that era see that as self-indulgent, or they just haven't paid attention to it in their lives. And yet we know that things like being in nature is healing to our autonomic nervous system, and being active, physically active, and seeing art, seeing beautiful things. The sense of awe, we know now, sends happy healing chemicals through our bodies. Many or most of us know that instinctively. That's why we love a gorgeous sunset or the face of a newborn baby. Those bring up a sense of awe in us and beauty, and that's literally self-healing to our jarred up autonomic nervous system. That we get calm when we're by the beach or a waterfall or a river. That's true to the end of our lives. And that's, leisure development, but it's also physically healing for us to be in nature. That's been proven again and again. Ancient civilizations, of course, knew this intimately, but we've forgotten, and we're getting back there. Helping people find meaning in their lives, and it might be through telling their story, not necessarily their trauma story. Not everybody wants or needs to tell that, but that they feel that they have a purpose on this planet still, that they matter to somebody, that they have things to teach and to share. And if we set things up that we are regularly asking elderly people to contribute their wealth of experience, of wisdom, of knowledge, it helps them come to a sense of meaning and purpose, and that alone can heal trauma. That's called post-traumatic growth, and I think we're going to get to that in a minute. And then, of course, we already said, I told you I was going to say it a couple times, the components of trauma-informed care are, if we have to teach people what it means to be self-compassionate, that they matter just as much as anybody else, that they should be tender and careful with themselves and do healing, soothing things. Excuse me. And then, of course, healthy attachments. And you're one of those people. For many, if you're working directly, you are a healthy attachment, somebody who will show empathy, who will listen, and who will allow them to talk and heal in that way. So, trauma-informed care isn't just about dealing with that person's errant behavior. It's really about understanding that their body and brain has encapsulated trauma, and if we work on that, their behavior is going to change, because we coax them away from that reptilian fear-based brain just by the atmosphere and the way we treat them and what they have access to. Human and social engagement absolutely has to be an integral part of trauma-informed care. Loneliness kills people, literally. It also makes them suicidal, often. Human and social, we're wired as a species. We're not the only species. There are other species that are wired to be social animals. And without it, we wither. And sometimes we die if it's extreme. So social engagement, and not the kind that we think is good for them, but what do they think? Get their ideas. We can do work to help them develop a felt sense of themselves. Traumatized people often are disconnected from their bodies in a way, And that's why grounding exercises and Tai Chi and yoga and mindfulness and anything that helps them come back to themselves and help center and calm that autonomic nervous system gets them back in touch with, I can feel me. I know, I'm my own entity instead of sort of all over the place and just kind of walking around fearful and anxious. So that atmosphere of safety, nurturing, a predictable atmosphere, a respectful atmosphere, I think that's missing sometimes, unfortunately, in some facilities. Maybe because of a general sense that the elderly don't have that much to offer, and I'm not talking about you folks, but maybe others, that work there or come in contact with elderly folks. If we can provide and insist on a respectful atmosphere, keep them connected, informed about what's going on with themselves and where they are. So I like what Mary Pfeiffer has to say about relationships, that they reintroduce people who have suffered to the community of love. And that's true. That's not pie in the sky woo-woo. That's neurologically, that's literally true. So we back to these two predictors, secure attachment and self-compassion are the two major components of healing, and there's 1,000 ways to provide that. Here's a bunch of activities, and even if we run out of time, we're 2:25, we're good. So anything that helps people stay with their sensations, grounding exercises, even just simple things like having them sit in a chair and then say, touch your knees and then touch the sides of your face and touch your nose and, pull your hands together. Those are simple grounding exercises that calm the autonomic nervous system and help get them out of the fear-based brain. Because a lot of people have been traumatized, dissociate, and they lose touch with their bodies. All these sensory and regulatory activities, it's kind of cool because some of these are ancient, and we're coming back around to realizing, oh, those people knew what they were talking about. It's interesting to me that virtually every culture at some time had drumming circles or drumming of some kind, where there's two things about drumming that are healing. One is the rhythmic nature that gets our central nervous system back in check, and the other is the communal nature of a drumming circle. I think it's one of the simplest, cheapest, most reliable things you can do with people who need healing is to do drumming circles. And they don't have to say a word. They don't have to talk about their trauma. But it's a way to connect and also, and I think that's why cultures did drumming. They figured out on their own, this feels really good. This gets us ready for the hunt. Or this is a great way for us to feel connected and attached to one another. Another is Tai Chi. The slow, rhythmic, besides the fact that it builds strength for elderly people, it's a gentle exercise. It's also that and yoga keeps people in touch with their bodies, head to toe, which is very important to get that nervous system centralized. Singing. Individually or group singing provides that attachment piece, but singing, because loud singing requires that you breathe and it's also expressive, it's very healing. So keeping that in mind for how that can formally or informally be made part of your offerings. Deep breathing, teaching people to deep breathe. As a psychotherapist, no matter what age of person I've worked with over the decades, the one thing I've taught, one coping skill that I've taught more than any other is deep breathing, because, many of us don't breathe right. We live in a hyper stimulated world and we're always shallow breathing, and that's not the way we should be breathing. Shallow breathing is for when we're running from the tiger, but otherwise, deep breathing is what allows us to calm our system, to open up our brain because it gets more oxygen, and therefore we're more alert, we're more able to make, logical decisions, etc. Deep breathing is healing for anybody, and including traumatized people. And there's lots of, in my all day workshop of this topic, we do a variety of deep breathings, but if you look up deep breathing to heal the autonomic nervous system, you'll see all kinds of examples in YouTube videos that teach you, and you can in turn, teach the folks you work with. Massage might be something they're interested in, maybe not, especially if their trauma is related to sexual or physical abuse. So it might not be something they're quite ready for, but because it clears out the lymph system and it relaxes the muscles, and it can be, and dance and movement. It's expressive. It's often done in a group, so it provides those communal experiences, and it allows people to be in their body. It's beautiful. So whether they're just encourage them to dance on their own to their favorite music, or to come up with a little dance with their, peers, or take a class, some kind of, gentle dance. Those small trampolines, for the same reason that drumming regulates the nervous system, as soon as you jump on one of those trampolines, and a lot of elderly people, that would be dangerous for them, but if it's not, it immediately sets up a rhythmic beat, and it's physical. And then rocking chairs. Interestingly, right? Why do we have rocking chairs? Because long ago people figured out that kind of rhythmic movement actually recenters our autonomic nervous system. That's why we rock babies in rocking chairs, because it does for them as well. And so having things like that, things that, and some of you, it's not in your role, but if you're a therapist or a, recreational person at a facility or something, helping people that seem really stressed out or traumatized find clues that right now they're not in danger, because their brain is still telling them, yep, life is scary. So it's our voice and the voice of trusted others, engaging their sense of smell, focusing on the breath, music, visualization, a focus on beauty, or just taking them to an art museum or gallery, beautiful music, nature. All of those things keep them in the here and now, and just remind them, right now it's okay. Right now, what I'm looking at, what I'm surrounded by is okay. So that all helps. That's not just sort of nice things to do if we have time. It's really a way to help them kind of tamp down, the stress and fear they have. And then grounding activities, like I said before, physical contact to their own bodies, even rubbing their hands together, shaking out their arms. There's something called a 5-4-3-2-1 sensory grounding technique. I'll let you look that up on your own because of the time thing, but it's you don't need any equipment, and you can do it when somebody seems freaked out. Maybe I can just go through that with you. Basically, I won't get it in the right order. It's saying, okay, bear with me. If they trust you, say, okay, look around and name 5 things you see, and they name it. And then you say, what are 4 things that you hear? And then what are 3 things that you feel? And, what are 2, and so on and so forth. It just helps them focus on the here and now and tune in to their senses, rather than staying sort of hypervigilant and stressed out. Laughing. Most of us know that laughing is a de-stressor. That's another thing that every culture has, is humor, and that tells me it's an evolutionary development that has helped us survive. It's a de-stressor tool, it's a connector, and so humor, comedy, whether that's, their own jokes or shows and movies, or going out to a comedy show, or writing their own comedy skit, laughing, I think we all know this, is healing. And then the fact that we know scientifically that nature is a multivitamin. It literally heals us. And who doesn't know this? I know myself, I need to be out in the woods at least once a week, or I start to suffer. I start to feel yucky. So whether that's the woods, the beach, a creek, just outside in a beautiful garden, extremely healing. Let many people find that out for themselves. And then any creative area is we can engage their brain with art, music, theater, all of that stuff. Art projects aren't just, oh, let's give them something to do for an hour. It should be meaningful art. It should be something they love. It can be tactile. So art that involves clay, or that's even better because it keeps them in touch with their bodies. So letting them sort of just play with art, the accoutrements of art and all kinds. Communal rituals where they're not just hanging out with other older people, but that you help them come up with little rituals, little practices that they can do on a regular basis. Maybe they all go around and share something, or maybe they do a gratitude list, or whatever it might be. That communal ritual that supplies those healthy attachments, and it also allows them to be expressive, and it's something to look forward to, and so it regulates their days, things like that. And equine and other therapy, we know that pets lower blood pressure, they increase our immune system responses. Not all facilities are set up to have pets, but if we can get elderly in touch with pets, if they can visit pets, if they can be allowed to have a pet, or to have somebody bring in a pet now and then, and pet them, and just be with animals. Horses are do I have any horse people here? Because I always have somebody who says, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. The connection that people have with their horses is very profound, and I don't have all the explanations, but there's particular reasons for that. But people who are horse people talk about the almost supernatural nature of the connections they have with their horses. But they also, with dogs and cats and some other animals as well. So just thinking about how can we build these and other soothing, healing factors into the lives of the elderly. I know budgets is a big concern, but laughing and nature and rocking and communal rituals don't cost a thing. So maybe just taking a look at the list of things that we've covered to try to bring back to wherever you're doing your work, or to suggest to people who are doing direct care. So post-traumatic growth exists. In other words, people can turn their pain into a deeper understanding of themselves and their humanity. There's such a thing as transformative suffering. It's not to say that, oh, thank goodness I suffered because I've been transformed. What it means is suffering itself, if we allow it, if we help other people with it, can transform who and what they are. And here's Viktor Frankl. He's one of Nelson Mandela is another globally known person who participated in transformative suffering. So I'll just kind of end with Viktor Frankl's quote that there's nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. I think a fantastic question to ask an elderly person in any setting is, what would give your life more meaning? What would give you a sense of purpose? And do what you can to help them develop that. See what resources you can make available to them. Help them track down the people or the things or the practices that provide a sense of purpose and meaning. And in the same vein, Mary Pfeiffer says, suffering is redemptive when it leads to a deeper understanding of ourselves. So here are some recommended reading and resources. The first one I have is The Body Keeps Us Score. This is so fabulous. His gift is taking tons and tons of scientific research and kind of funneling it down to everyday language. And it's a fabulous book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And then there's some other resources. So perhaps what I can do, because I've been yapping at you for an hour and whatever, I'd like to know, for my own sake, and just also as a little review, could everybody tell me one thing that was particularly meaningful to you today about what was presented? You know what? If you are chatting with me, I apologize. I can't see the chat, and maybe that's one of the things that's happened. I'm going to get rid of this, and hopefully, maybe that's, oops. Yeah, somehow I just don't have access to the chat. So I really apologize if you were trying to send me messages. It disappeared and I never got it back. Who'd like to let me know what was useful particularly today?
For me, I think it was the concept that the effects of trauma are cumulative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I can see why so many of the people that struggle in my line of business, the elderly, are so anxious.
Yes. Yes, so anxious. And maybe they weren't when they were younger, but now they are because additional, right? Additional. I
Yeah.
found my chat. Oh, thank you.
Yay.
Yes, that keeping that kindling effect in mind. So thank you. Nancy said offering choice. Yep, during recreational activities. Sherry said it was helpful understanding trauma. Wayne, I appreciate the load of facts and details, and especially ideas for helping. Good. I like the idea of some of the activities like drumming. I love the idea of drumming. Oh, there's some more up here too. Oh, see, people, I'm so sorry. Loss of a spouse of a couple widows. I really apologize. I couldn't see the chat, so I was not ignoring you before. I was asking for example. So, okay. I don't provide direct care, but close contact with those who do in the course of my work. Yeah, you can certainly pass on all this information. The PowerPoint itself is a resource for you to share with people and maybe do a mini training of your own of some of the things we talked about. Good to have a refresher. Nancy said, appreciate the key words to keep in mind: secure attachment, self-compassion, safety control. Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for your attention, for what you do for elderly people on this planet.